One of the great benefits of implementing directory services on premises is to have the ability to manage your user accounts and be able to control users as groups and manage the authentication services through your user accounts. But there's also another component of it, which is the devices. The devices themselves can also be managed and controlled and also reported upon the same way that we manage and control our user accounts. The devices can therefore also be part of the Active Directory structure. And the way that that's done is by joining devices to the Active Directory structure. So Azure AD provides the ability to join also computers, devices to its directory structure. And the way that that's done and that it's managed is also here under Users and Groups. I have a list of options under Device Settings. Now, when I click on Device Settings, I see that the first option is the option that defines whether or not users are allowed to join devices to Azure AD. So you see that by default, this is set to all, so all users can join their devices to Azure AD. Or I can have a selected group of users that are allowed to join to Azure AD. Or I can totally disable the functionality and no users will be allowed to join their devices. Now I'm going to keep the all setting by default and therefore allow users to join. I have another option here, additional local administrators on Azure AD joined devices. This allows me to add users to the local administrators group on computers that are joined to AD. So let's say I have other administrators in my Azure AD and those administrators are in charge of devices. I could automatically add their user accounts to the Azure AD joined computer, so directly onto those computers' local administrators group. Now, this is a functionality that is only available through Azure AD Premium, so you need a premium subscription for that. Now, if I go down my list of options here, there's some additional options, such as whether or not I want to have multi-factor authentications, whether or not users are allowed to register devices, not join registration. This is also known as a workplace join. And also I can specify the maximum number of devices that can be joined by a specific user. So by default, on-premises network actually used to have this limit as 10 in previous versions of Windows. It then was incremented to 20. I see here that the limit in Azure AD in this version is currently 20 by default, but you can go ahead and modify that. Now, if you have a specific group of low-level administrators that are in charge of going around to computers and just joining those computers to Azure AD, you may want to provide them with unlimited ability to join devices so that they are not limited after joining 20 computers. Now, there's some other options here as well, such as the ability to sync settings and apps across multiple devices, essentially allowing the devices to mesh together so that the settings are identical for a user regardless on which machine the user logs into. So this is how I configure my settings in Azure AD to define who's allowed to join computers and then what happens when those computers are joined or what happens in order to join the computers. Now, once the computers are actually joined to the Azure AD, all the information about those computers is going to be stored in Azure AD. Therefore, I can assign policies to those computers. They will be completely managed by my Azure AD. I can report upon the data of those computers. So, for example, if I want to filter information about all the various computers that have Windows 10 and which update they're running, I'm able to retrieve that information because that information is going to be now stored in Azure AD. So all the information about the devices and how users interact with those devices once they log onto it can be controlled and managed through Azure AD if I join the computers to the domain. Now, I want to point out right away that there is an additional functionality also through enterprise management systems. There's EMS or OMS as well as part of Azure is a functionality or an add-on functionality that you can enable to have more control over those devices. So Windows Intune is part of that list of functionalities that allows you to have great control over those devices, push applications to the devices, push policies to the devices, and also do a great amount of management based on versions and operating systems and hardware definitions of those devices. So I encourage you to look into EMS and OMS and Windows Intune. So now let's take a look at how you actually join a computer to Azure AD. So in order to do that, I have here a computer that's Windows 10. I'm just going to go to my local computer here. And if you go to the Windows settings from the computer, so just you type in the start button and type on settings. From the Windows settings, you will be able to go into your accounts. If I click on accounts, you'll notice that you can connect here to access work or school. So I can click here on access work or school. And here I'm going to have the option to connect. Now, when I click connect here, it's actually going to give me two options, which is join this device to an Azure Active Directory or join this device to a local Active Directory domain. So this is an on-premises Active Directory domain, and this is an Azure Active Directory domain. At this point, I just need to specify my username and password. It will connect to that domain based on my suffix of my username. So if my username finishes by @litware.com, it will connect me to the litware.com domain. Ensure that my user account is authenticated, that I have the right to join the computer to the domain. I will have to reboot my computer, and now I am joined to the Azure Active Directory domain.